Hello, I'm Susan Rakes, Director of Learning for the Science Museum Group, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to tonight's virtual event, the latest edition in our Open Talk series. Exploring issues around diversity and inclusion, the Open Talk series aims to shine a light on untold stories of science that explore areas including race and identity, unconscious bias in tech, and inequality in STEM. We've welcomed some fabulous speakers to this series, including Sir Tim Berners-Lee, Amanda Cozy-McQuarrie, and MPs Chris Bryant and David Lammy. And we've collaborated with the Guilty Feminists, the Migration Museum, and the European Space Agency. Tonight's Open Talk will focus on video games, one of the most popular forms of entertainment and a staple of popular culture for almost 6 decades, and their potential to be an effective tool to improve our mental health. Video games have often been associated with having harmful effects on our mental health, particularly for young people. But is this truly the case? Could video games, in fact, have a positive effect on our mental well-being and cognitive abilities, and even have therapeutic uses? In tonight's talk, a panel of experts in the worlds of gaming and psychology will give their insights and discuss the fascinating connections between gaming and the mind. We've assembled a brilliant panel to examine the subject, and I'm delighted now to hand over to our chair for this evening, Glyn Morgan, Exhibitions Curator at the Science Museum. Glyn, over to you.
Hello, good evening to all of you online, and thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Glyn Morgan, Curator of Exhibitions here at the Science Museum in London, and I'm very pleased to be here to welcome you to the latest edition of the Science Museum Group's Open Talks series. So as you've just heard, in this special virtual event, I'm going to be joined by a panel of experts from the world of gaming and psychology to discuss video games and the potential effects that they may have on our mental health. So video games have, of course, been a huge staple of our popular culture for 60 years. It is a fact commonly cited that the video games industry today has a larger annual revenue than the film and music industries combined. However, being immensely popular, and perhaps because they are so popular, video games have also been associated with having harmful effects on our mental health, particularly with regards to young people. But is this truly the case? Well, we're going to dig into that today and find out whether or not that's true, and also to discuss the positive effects on our mental health and our cognitive abilities, and even the therapeutic uses of video games. So that's what we'll be discussing this evening. And so with no further ado, let's introduce our fabulous panel. So in no particular order, first of all, we have Dr. Kelli Dunlap. Welcome, Kelli. Kelli is a clinical psychologist, game designer, and community director at Take This, a mental health advocacy organization with a focus on the game industry and community. She's also the editor of a book about the psychology of Bluey, which is due out later this year. Welcome, Kelli.
Thank you.
And next up is Professor Peter Etchells. He is the Professor of Psychology and Science Communication at Bath Spa University and author of Lost in a Good Game, Why We Play Games and What They Can Do for Us, as well as Unlocked, The Real Science of Screen Time and How to Spend It Better, which is being published in, I believe, just a few days. Welcome, Pete.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, it's Thursday, so it's a big week.
There you go. You've got a lot going on. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Jane McGonigal, Director of Games Research and Development at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California. She's a game designer, inventor, and co-founder of SuperBetter, a game-based learning platform that empowers mental health, and the best-selling author of Reality is Broken, Why Games Make Us Better and How They Change the World, and SuperBetter, The Power of Living Gamefully. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you.
So, welcome to all of my panelists. Thank you for joining us. And let's kick off this discussion. First of all, I'd like to talk to Kelli and ask you about your own experience as a clinical psychologist and game designer. So, what would you say are some of the most believed misconceptions about the effects of gaming?
I think one of the most common ones is that video games are a waste of time. That is probably the one I hear most from parents when I'm working with kids and young adults. Is it's just a time sink and it's frivolous and it's pointless, and there's some concern around that. And so I always try to reassure parents that video games are never a waste of time. As humans, we need to play throughout our entire lives, from the times we are babies to the times that we're, old ladies in our rocking chairs. Play is absolutely fundamental to our health and happiness throughout the entire lifespan. And games are just a way that we kind of get those play needs met when we're older. If I was to go out back and swing on the swing, someone might think that's odd, me wanting to be playful in that way. But it's okay for me to play games, and that's really exciting. And then the friendships and the connections that we make in our gameplay online are very, very real. And that's another thing that comes up a lot in my work is, well, he met this person online. An online friend isn't a real friend. And so kind of reforming conversations about, well, what do we mean by real and what do we mean by online, and how is one real and maybe one not? So those are two of the most common ones that I get in my practice. And of course, there's always the questions about, are games bad for kids? Are they bad for me? And that's usually tied to they're a waste of time type of thing. And it's always important to remind people that there's always time for play, and we need to make time and space for it.
Love that. And of course, advocating room for play and the idea of video games as play. But I would say, don't let anyone tell you can't go out and be on a swing either. That's perfectly acceptable.
All right.
So video games, yeah. Next time someone tells you off, just go with it. But video games are increasingly being used as a form of therapy in mental health settings as well. So there's not just the issue of them, whether they're good or bad for us in our homes. They're actually being used by practitioners now, including as part of individuals' treatments for things like depression, anxiety, and even trauma. So what are games bringing to these areas of treatment that's different to previous therapies? And how effective are video games as tools in that sphere to help treat mental disorder?
So that's such a big question. In one way, games really aren't that different than other things that people have enjoyed. If a client comes in and they really like football, which, it is a game, but, you would go with them and you'd want to understand that. If they really liked a book series or a music artist, anything that a client finds value and connects with is just really rich data for a clinician. And games are the same thing. If someone comes to me and they're playing Fortnite, I want to know what it is. Like, what is it about Fortnite? Is it that you're playing with your friends? Is it that you can see your skill progress? Is it because you get to those victory royales and you can feel a sense of accomplishment? What is it about this gameplay that you enjoy? And that's tends to be how I use games in my therapeutic practice, is more of, tell me what you play and let's talk about it, and then see what kind of themes we can pull out and how we can apply that to life outside of the game. There are other games that are literally developed for treating different kinds of mental health considerations. The one I'm most excited about is the use of games and VR for treating of phobias, because that's something that has been going on for a while and seems to have really strong practice effects. And so there's a million different ways that you can bring games in to make therapy more playful, more approachable, regardless of the age of the client. And so because games are pretty much a universal experience at this point, it's just this really convenient way to tap into something in a client that they care about, something that you can share, and really dig deep into something that's important to them that maybe you weren't able to access as deeply before with other mediums.
Great. Yeah, the idea of using games and VR to treat phobias is really exciting. I guess would that be exposure therapy, like that kind of?
Yes.
Yeah. So I remember being taught about this in school, and the old idea would be you've got a fear of spiders, so you put your hand into a a tub of spiders, a vat of spiders. This seems
Okay, that would be
much safer for
abuse.
the.
Let's not let's not do
Yeah.
that.
Okay. That's the extreme end of the example, but this seems like something much more controllable and obviously much more flexible depending on people's individual traumas and phobias. That's really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So outside of the kind of clinical setting, is there evidence that playing video games can help us improve ourselves, improve our intelligence perhaps, or our problem solving abilities, or even our creativity?
The old story I always like to tell my mom is when I was a kid playing, hey mom, I'm playing video games. It's developing my hand-eye coordination. And it's true, like it does. But video games can also help us in a million different ways. Whenever you're playing a video game, you are learning. It just depends on whether or not the society around us values that learning. As a massive Halo fan, I can tell you the name of every weapon based on its outline, its clip count, what kind of enemy it's effective against, what situations to use it, and where to find it on any level. That is all learning, but unfortunately, it's not super applicable in my day-to-day life all the time. And so when we use games as a way to challenge ourselves, usually either to do something socially with our friends and hang out, and that of course is great for our well-being, or maybe we want to feel mentally challenged. I play Wordle every morning, and I find that just a nice little way to kick off my day with a little noodling on the brain in that regard. And so we tend to use games in ways that make our lives better. We seek out the games that make us into the people that we want to be. So whether that's smarter or faster or more engaged in the world around us with our friends, with our physical health, that's what we tend to seek out in the games that we play.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, it's a good point, actually. We didn't define video games at the beginning of this talk, but many people watching this might not think of themselves as a gamer, whatever that means, but they might do Wordle every single day. And so the idea that actually, these things are part of our lives in lots of different ways, not just, people who play Halo to the extent that they can memorize it in the level of detail that you can. Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Kelli, for starting us off. We'll come back to you shortly, but now I'm going to talk to Peter Etchells. Hi, Pete.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed your book, Lost in a Good Game. And one of the things that I was struck by with it were the descriptions of the various research studies that have been done historically on the psychological effect of video games. But maybe you could kind of explain for the audience who haven't yet read your book, to what extent do we truly understand scientifically those psychological effects and the often cited possibility of the side effects of long-term gaming?
Not a massive amount, really. And I think something that you mentioned when you were talking to Kelli then is a really good lead into that, this idea that, we didn't define what video games were at the start of this talk. That's a real problem in lots of different ways for the research area, and that it's never quite clear if you try and look at the whole spread of research across the area, what it is people are trying to do very often. And that's true even if you look at it in the context of something like, the classic one is violent video games. Do they or do they not cause aggression? And part of the reason that I pick on that area, it's probably a bit tired for a lot of us in the room, that subject, but it comes up time and time again. We worry about it a lot. And I feel like from my perspective as a researcher, it's really sort of sucked the oxygen out of the room trying to answer that question. And it's meant that we've not focused as much time on answering other interesting questions about video games. So, what a violent video game is very poorly defined in the research literature. I'm not clear what that is. One of my favorite papers in the area was from, I think, nearly 20 years ago now, where a bunch of researchers tried to set out and quantify levels of violence in different sorts of games. And I think Centipede came out as the most violent game at something like 92% violent. But, I think that's a really nice example of how there are sincere efforts to try and quantify this stuff and do research on it, but it ends up being remarkably hard because the nature of how we play video games, the way that we interact with them, doesn't lend itself particularly well to recreating those conditions in the lab.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I would say to anyone who's interested in your book is that even if you're not interested in video games, it's actually really interesting as an example of how many badly organized sociological studies there have been around the topic of video games because of these, often poorly defined terms or very subjective terms. And actually, I learned a lot about, as someone who is not a sociologist or working in that experimental field, learned a lot about how you actually set up these experiments and kind of biases and things like that. It was, very interesting. Thank you for just peeling the lid off slightly for us there, and we'll definitely come back to that. Coming back to games more generally, despite having been in our lives, our cultural lives, for half a century,
it's understandable where this comes from, I think, and I think about this question a lot. And it's not just in the context of video games, but in the context of digital technologies more generally. We talk about these things, and we talk about them being addictive. And I think very often, certainly when it comes to video games, when we say we find it addictive, or we're addicted to that particular game, what we actually mean is that we really like it and we really play it quite a lot. And sometimes, occasionally, that might mean we've played it and maybe we played it too much. That is not addiction. In the clinical sense, that's not addiction. But what you see time and time again in the research literature is this cycle, particularly around digital technologies, particularly around video games, where this new technology comes along, video games come along, everybody starts playing them. Some people say, oh, this is great, I'm really addicted to it. And a bunch of researchers come along and go, oh, everybody's addicted to this thing, we should look into this. And the starting point for the research is very often this assumption that an addiction exists and we therefore just need to find it and characterize it. And that's not necessarily the case. But we've done a pretty bad job, I think, over the past 20, 30 years of actually trying to characterize it. So gaming disorder, which is another way of saying gaming addiction, it's the only digital addiction that's formalized in any sort of clinical diagnostic manual. The WHO formally recognized it as that in 2018. Now, if you look at the WHO's website, where they talk about gaming disorder, they reference a meta-analysis that was conducted in 2020, looking at the state of play of research in this area. And they look at something like 160 studies. And across 160 studies, there are 35 different ways in which gaming disorder can be measured. And the prevalence rate, so how many people in the gaming population might have something that you call gaming disorder, across those studies, the prevalence rate is anywhere from 0.2% of the gaming population up to about 58%. So what we're saying there is that for a formalized clinical disorder, we don't know how many people have a problem with it. It could be none. It could be nobody, basically, in the gaming population. It could be basically everybody. And that says to me that we've not really got a handle on what this thing is yet. Is it a unique disorder in and of itself? Have we mislabeled something? Are we actually going around giving people gambling addiction questionnaires, but we've called it gaming by mistake, so we're actually characterizing something else? So for me, the science is very much not settled on what this is. That's not to say that there aren't people who won't struggle and face difficulties with gaming behaviors. There certainly are those people. It's not to deny that they exist. But I really feel, as a psychologist, I feel we've done everybody a disservice there, in that we've not figured out who the people are that actually need help and why, and how gaming feeds into that. So there's still quite a big discussion around, is gaming the root cause of these sorts of disorders, or is it a way that people are coping with something else that's going on in lives, other difficulties, but we're sort of worrying about the wrong thing, as it were. So I talk about this a lot. I'm worried that the easy response there from games developers is to go, oh, that guy's saying that gaming addiction doesn't exist, so we will buy that line, and then ignore everything. And I think that's also the wrong tact to take with this, because I think there are some real risk areas in games development, particularly around the way that they're monetized. So I do research on things like loot boxes, which is a type of mechanism in a game that it basically looks, a lot of people are worried that this looks quite a lot like slot machine type gambling, and therefore should we regulate it? And again, the research is quite messy there at the minute. We don't know what the root thing is that's going on. But my worry is that if we societally have quite panic-driven conversations that aren't grounded in good science, it's very easy to ignore those and dismiss them as hyperbole, right? And then just carry on doing stuff that maybe might end up not being so good. So I think we need to get better. I mean, scientists certainly need to get better at doing research on this stuff. I think we need to get better at having conversations around them that aren't driven by those cycles of panic, that don't come back to the same things over and over again. And if we can do that, we can focus on what games should be. You know, to me, games are fundamentally technologies of entertainment, right? So they should have that, and they should have player well-being at their core.
Great. Thank you so much. That's really insightful. Thank you for sharing those insights, actually, Pete. So we're definitely going to come back and talk a bit more about that later. But now I think I'm going to come to Jane, last but by no means least. Good evening to you, or good morning for you.
Yes. Thank you, Glyn. I've been writing down so many notes about things I want to say.
I know.
This conversation is already so fascinating.
You have the advantage of going last. You can just build on everyone else's notes. But you're currently the director of game research and development at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto in California, as I said in our introduction. Could you tell us a bit about what you do there and how you're currently using games to help people achieve their real world goals?
Yes. So you may have noticed that people feel a lot of anxiety about the future these days. A lot of it has to do with climate change, rising political extremism, people feeling like there are technological advances coming that they're not prepared for or not in control of. And one of the main areas of my research at the Institute for the Future is trying to figure out if there are lessons we can learn from the psychology of gaming to help people bring that sense of agency and creativity and natural optimism towards future challenges. And I can just give you one quick example of something kind of interesting that we're seeing right now, kind of back and forth between gamers and the future. We're seeing this explosion of breakthrough advances in AI technologies that humans need to collaborate with to be effective. So ChatGPT, Midjourney, DALL-E, all these large learning models that suddenly students are using to write and workers are using to design and develop and brainstorm. And this idea that in the future it will be a really important life skill, citizen skill, work skill to be able to collaborate with these AI systems. That's a space where video gaming actually really effectively has prepared generations, particularly the latest generation coming up, because who spends more time hanging out with AI than video gamers, right? They're developing those core skills of collaborating with bots or leading bots and talking to NPCs. And when you actually try to get these large learning models to do something effective, it's very much an iterative process like gaming, right? You have to kind of try different strategies, ask things in different ways. It's very much similar to that gameful quality of trying to understand a system and play with it and try and tweak your strategies until you get the outcome that you want. Now, what does that have to do with mental health? Well, for people who are feeling like the future is coming too fast, it's really a boost to confidence, and a sense of the clarity and how we can effectively cope with the future that's coming by thinking about how these core gaming skills of collaborating with AI are actually becoming life skills and learning skills and work skills and art skills. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to do, is like sort of see the back and forth between what will be required of us in the future in the real world, and what we can build as core skills in gaming.
Great, and I feel like part of what you were saying there kind of follows on from Peter's point about not knowing the reasons why people are so invested in video games. Like, you know, there might be a reason that has nothing to do with games why people feel the need to escape into gaming. As you've said, there's a lot of challenges out there in the world, and you can see why a virtual world might seem more appealing in different ways. But if you can be developing a skill while you're there, then actually, yeah, it can be super beneficial. Throughout your career in game design, you've been a huge advocate for how video games can have that tremendous, like, positive impact on individuals and on society. To what extent do you think that video games can be an important tool for making a better future? Like as you said about collaborating with AI and how that's going to become an important part of our life. But are there other ways as well?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of the field of mental health and mental health care, you know, it's important to understand the question of this convening tonight is, can games help our mental health? What are the theories underlying that? Like, what would a hypothesis be? Why would a game be good for our mental health? And there's a theory of mental resilience and well-being called self-determination theory that has become increasingly acknowledged, particularly for the development of young people's mental health. And there's three things that you need to have to sort of grow up and be sort of a happy, well-adjusted, confident person. The first is autonomy, so the ability to make choices about how you spend your time and what you do with your days. You need to have a sense of competency, that you can gain new skills, that you can learn through your own effort and time invested. And you need a sense of relatedness or belonging to be able to think of a community or group bigger than yourself and have their esteem, like that you matter to them. And gaming, we're increasingly understanding, is a really brilliant way, particularly for young people, to develop these three key strengths. Right, when you play a game, it's an unnecessary obstacle that you're choosing for yourself. You're not, you don't have to be trying to level up in Pokemon Go or going on the Zelda quest or whatever it is you've chosen for yourself. This, how you want to spend your time, this is the type of challenge that excites me. And every time you learn a new game, you're proving to yourself your own competency. Every time you learn a new game, you're going to be bad at it the first time you play. And that experience of, through your own efforts and your time invested and being willing to ask others for help and tap into learning communities that you can get better, that builds competency. And then, of course, having people that you play with, having your family members look over your shoulder and say, like, wow, that looks really hard. What are you doing? Is that stressful? How are you keeping calm? When you can be in relation with family, friends, and the larger gaming community and build that sense of belonging. So I would say, as we look ahead to the future of games and mental health, self-determination theory will be a really important part of that, and looking for opportunities to bring it into classrooms, into therapeutic practice, into self-help, to understand that these are real benefits, that gaming seems to be just very well suited to allowing us to experience when maybe other parts of our lives don't always give us that autonomy or competency or relatedness that we want. But once we get it in games, of course, we can then learn how to find it in our whole lives, right? You don't want to just get it from games. You want to say, wow, I'm somebody with competency. Where else can I feel that? Or I'm someone who does belong. Who else can I connect with?
Great. And yeah, like, thinking again about game design, you mentioned that when you start a game, you will often not be good at it. at the beginning, and if you find a game too easy as soon as you get into it, often people react badly to that. Like, they want that kind of graduate difficulty curve and development of skills. So it's also good game design to have that kind of process as well, which is great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for those thoughts, Jane. So we're now going to open this up to the whole panel. So in this section of the event, I may direct some of the questions towards specific speakers, and please answer. But if another speaker would like to jump in or build on another's question, answer, follow up on their thoughts, please do so. Let's make this into a proper chat as much as we can. Having said that, I am going to direct my first question to Peter, because I was thinking again about a moment that really touched me in your book, where you talk about your relationship with Halo 3, and one specific map. And I was wondering if you'd be able to tell us that story, because I think it really beautifully illustrates the way in which our relationship to video games change and evolves in quite powerful ways, and how another thing that we don't want to fall into the trap of doing here is to think of gaming or games as a static thing. One game does not mean one thing all the time, even to one individual.
I love that question, because it means that I get to talk about my friend Robbie. So I did my PhD at Bristol, and I at the time I made friends with a guy there who was doing a postdoc, a guy called Robbie Cooper, and he was super cool. He was like this gentle Scottish giant. He played in a band. He was drummer. He was basically everything I wanted to be. And we had a mutual interest in video games, and we ended up playing Halo quite a lot. And then a couple of years later, he moved away from Bristol. He moved up to Edinburgh for a job up there, and we kept in touch. And the way that we kept in touch was through playing Halo. We'd jump on, back in the days before I had kids and I could play games whenever I wanted to. We'd set up a game, and we'd just put the headsets on and we'd just chat a lot. And a lot of the time we were playing Halo, not playing Halo. We'd play multiplayer, and we'd just get a warthog and drive around a map for a bit, occasionally firing rocket launchers at people just for the sake of it. But most of the time it was just to connect, really. Robbie died 10 years ago now. It's 2014, so it's 10 years this year. And I don't really play Halo much anymore now. But I do find myself from time to time going back to some of the maps that we used to play on. We played all of them, right? You don't just play one map in Halo. But I found myself going back to Valhalla quite a lot, and I realized when I was writing Lost in a Good Game, I'm not sure that was it's a bit cheesy, right? Going back to Valhalla to remember a friend. I just liked the map. That's all, really. And I found myself going back to it, not to play a game. I'd sort of just set up a single person multiplayer game, so it was literally just me on the map, just so I could just drive around in a warthog and fire rockets. And it was a way for me to remember him, and it was a way to remember those times that we had playing. I don't get a chance to do that as much nowadays, but I do try every now and again when I can fire up the old Xbox. I do try and just have a quick single multiplayer game in Halo to try and remember him.
Thank you for sharing that. The more you look up the topic of grief in video games, the more you find stories like this, actually. And I remember reading one about someone who'd been playing Rally Sports Challenge, which is a relatively obscure Xbox racer, and he found his father's save file still on there, and his dad had died, and he loaded it up and was able to race against his dad's old record, and in gaming terminology we call that a ghost. So he's literally racing against his dad's ghost. It's just, there's a we talk about mental health, but coping with grief is a really important factor of the kind of the social element of gaming that doesn't even require anything more than you and the game in the end. I don't know if anyone else had any thoughts on that, but I just wanted to really pull up it. Sorry, Jane, you look like you were gonna...
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Thank you for telling us that story, by the way, Pete, about Robbie. I think it's really overlooked the long journey that we can go on with our favorite games. People spend so many years playing these games with so many people. And just to kind of offer another example, which doesn't have grief baked into it, but kind of speaks to the power of games to tell stories about our lives. Pokemon Go came out the year after my twin daughters were born. And that was the first, video game we ever let them play with us on our phones and taking walks and catching Pokemon. And when you catch a Pokemon or evolve it, there's a date in the game, right? And my daughter was just this week looking through our Pokédex and everyone we'd collected, and she was saying, "Oh, I remember we caught that one." She's like, "We were so young. We just started playing," and she has all these memories. Well, they're 9 now, and they started playing when they were 3, right? So we have this whole journey that we've been on for 6 years now, playing one game, and I think that there's something, the meaning of games gets really bound up in our relationships and our lives and how we change, but how we can revisit game worlds where maybe we were like a different version of ourselves. And it's a place of memory, who we were when we first started playing these games and how we've changed. And there's just something very profound that gets overlooked. This particular art form, it's different. It's a little bit different from movies and books. Music is maybe the closest I can think of. We have the sort of soundtrack of our lives. We can listen to the song and revisit it. But games provide us that same kind of ability to almost time travel and be with different versions of ourselves or different people that we played with.
I love the idea of video games as a form of time travel. That's that's a really nice one. Thinking about, I mentioned ghosts and save files. Thinking about gaming terminology more generally, it's funny to me how it's kind of permeated our everyday lives in quite a noticeable way. Seems to me, anyway, in relatively recent years, whether that be the plans to level up, which is quite a buzzword, at least in politics on this side of the Atlantic, or when someone announces on their social media achievement unlocked, I've just bought my first house or whatever. Maybe not. But this growing kind of linguistic familiarity, it has me wondering, is it possible that the systems that are created to get us through video games, to make them enjoyable, those gameplay loops and things, whether those are like thinking about missions or side quests or building experience points, are these mindsets that can help us navigate the real world and its many challenges? Is that something we can kind of apply to everyday life? I mean, it speaks a lot to what you were talking about, Jane.
Yes, I mean, one of my biggest works in my career was an attempt to bring those mindsets to recovering from illness or injury. You mentioned at the top of the session, SuperBetter, which stemmed from my own experience dealing with suicidal ideation after a traumatic brain injury. And I was so desperate that I came up with this ridiculous at first idea to basically redefine my recovery process in gaming terminology, and particularly the kind of RPG aspects of the role-playing game where, in fact, I just was looking at this notebook a few weeks ago. My husband was keeping a notebook for me of all sort of my character strengths and my skills and abilities, and sort of giving me +3 points for this or that on any given day that I managed to be a productive person when I wasn't feeling very happy or productive. We've been able in the past decade to do randomized controlled studies, clinical trials, particularly with college age and high school age students, cancer patients, people recovering from concussions, clinical depression, anxiety. And all those studies suggested that if you are purposeful in applying these game mindsets to real life challenges, and it feels authentic to you, it definitely can help. You're not going to take like a non-gamer and tell them like, okay, we're going to gamify your depression and it's going to work. But for people who have had positive experiences, thinking about, what is a side quest? What does it mean to level up an attribute? What does it mean to have to go on a raid together? What are the different co-op roles that my friends or family can play in my recovery? Those mindsets can be applied in really positive ways. So, my encouragement is, if there is a type of game that you enjoy, to think about, how do people help each other in that game? Or if there aren't other players, how do, characters help each other? What's the learning culture? Where do you go for information when you need information? If you're stuck on a problem, what do you do? And you can just sort of reflect on how you overcome obstacles and who you overcome them with and what it feels like to use that agency. And then, there are systems that have been developed like SuperBetter, where you get help sort of translating your real life into those gameful mindsets. But it should be authentic to you, and it certainly won't work for everyone, especially if you're just, not someone who games naturally appeal to, or video games anyway. Everyone loves a game.
Yeah. Presumably as well, it has the benefit of, where in those situations where it's applicable and, the person being treated as a gamer, it's a common, if the therapist is also a gamer, it's a common lexicon that they can use to help explain, terms and techniques and that must be invaluable, especially with younger gamers and younger patients, I'd assume. Kelli, we discussed the potential that video games have
You
in the
just took my
treatment of mental
answer,
disorders.
so
Oh, sorry. Oh no. Well,
it's all
let me
good.
ask
It's
you
all
another
good.
question. Do you think that we did touch on video games as treatment, and we've just talked about how the language itself could be helpful. But do you think that we're going to see more and more of that kind of use of games as treatment, perhaps, as you alluded to, purpose-built games rather than off-the-shelf commercial games? And do you see a day when they could even replace or become more dominant than traditional forms of treatment?
So we already see a lot of games and gameful experiences moving in that kind of direction. So I guess the short answer is yes. I think we're going to see more, partly because we have introduced the idea of being able to get FDA clearance on a video game to treat ADHD, which I use the word treat very skeptically. It can be an adjunct to therapy. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. Like, games can absolutely assist a therapist. So like myself, we're talking about the terminology. When I'm working with kids who love Pokemon, we talk about how, what would your evolution look like? And every Pokemon who evolves goes through a difficult trial before they hit that evolution. What would your difficult trial look like? What are your attributes? What are your strengths? What are the things that you're weak to? Let's talk about your health points and, that shared language, so we can talk about actually clinical things, but in a very approachable way. That's one way that we're already using games in that way. For games that are specifically targeted at treating things, we are seeing a lot of push to games can do it all, which is, it's a hopeful view of the future. And maybe it's my bias as a clinician, but I do see games becoming a tool, a more widely used and accepted tool, but they're never going to replace that human component, which research has shown consistently for decades that is the number one predictor of outcomes for mental health treatment, is that one-on-one connection with your therapist. And so again, as someone who loves games, when I work with clients who also like games, and they don't have to explain Pokemon Go to me, they don't have to explain Discord to me, they don't have to explain Twitch to me, you can see the rapport just skyrocket. You can see the willingness and the interest and the trust just really accelerate. And so what I want to see is more clinicians who feel comfortable talking about games, more gamers becoming clinicians so that they can talk about these things. Because in psychology spaces, as we talked a little bit earlier, we've kind of done games dirty in the past, and how we framed them as from the psychology perspective. So yes, I definitely want to see more tools. I want to see more games like Inventors with Anxiety that I can literally give to my clients and say, go play this, and then come back and let's talk about it. I want to see more things so that people's therapy sessions can exist for more than just the 1 hour inside my therapy office. Things that will support them in practicing these skills outside the room, not necessarily like a treatment, like, here, take take this pill of video game and call me in the morning. Although I think there are some people trying to do that, at least for mental health. I think that you still need that human component. And so where I really want to see it going is clinicians and game developers working more closely together to not replace the therapist or try to offer like a one-shot treatment, but really figuring out what we need and how games can help.
If gaming can be a pill, does that make Wordle microdosing? It's not a real question.
Like, I'm actually thinking about it.
Yeah.
Can I riff on that really quickly?
Go
like, what's
riff
the closest
away.
thing to just very shortly? Like, what's the closest thing to a video game and a pill? Because I like just like think practically what exists today, what people can use. If you suffer from rumination, so like you're constantly replaying things that happened in the past that are really bringing up a lot of negative feelings for you, or you're stuck imagining future events that are really creating a lot of anxiety that you can't successfully take action like to change, to solve. So it's just this negative experience of being like kind of unable to control what you're thinking about. There are sort of infinitely many video games that can be used in the moment to stop that rumination, even, that have been tested in clinical trials. Tetris has been shown in field work to help prevent flashbacks after, if you get in a road accident, using Super Mario in hospitals to be able to lower the amount of anti-anxiety medication pre-operation, which is better for recovery from pre-op. And, in my own life, I've used even stupid like little miniature golf simulators if I'm just getting stuck thinking about something that it's not helpful for me to keep thinking about, to shift. That's like the closest thing we have to video games being like take a pill and you feel better. But I don't think we should underplay how amazing and empowering it is to be able to put a halt to thoughts that are tormenting you. Play the game for 15 minutes and hopefully you've interrupted that thought cycle. That's like a pretty powerful thing to have access to.
Yeah, 100%. We've discussed video game worlds. I'm kind of intrigued about the idea that, Kelli, you said you wanted to see video games or a use of video games that extends beyond the office where the therapy is happening. I almost wonder, like, could you see a world where you could do the therapy in the video game? So, like, actually have a therapy session with your therapist and the patient, in World of Warcraft, for example. There you go. What a great idea I just had. It already exists.
There are definitely some sticky ethical concerns when doing that work. You have to be really, really mindful. For example, like you can't just talk over chat in a game. You have to have a safety secured line where the clinician and the client are talking. Like I said, spaces like those are coming up. They tend to be more popular in subclinical situations. So where they say, hey, come together for peer support, or, we're therapists, but we're not your therapist, but here's a space and it's a group and we're talking about our feelings, but we're not talking about group therapy. And so you do see people trying to like find this balance of where they can do this kind of support in an environment that's very natural and can feel safe to a lot of people, but also walk that ethical line of, okay, once we start calling something therapy, that has this whole other level of ethics and legality behind it. And so, yeah, it's an interesting kind of gray space at this moment. And there's some people who are working really hard and doing well with that. And there's some that aren't so much. And I think we've seen with telehealth, especially with COVID, everybody went to telehealth and a lot of people prefer it. And that's already therapy in a digital space. And there's some people who are like, no, I want to be in the office. And, that's okay too. It's, at least when it comes to mental health, it's all about trying to accommodate the person where they're at. And with that's meeting them literally in a game or in your video session or in your office. That's such an important part of establishing that trust with that person. And yeah, that whole meeting them where they're at thing.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And certainly, a lot of people discovered video games and that capacity for them during the pandemic. Even if it didn't stick, it proved a lot of that potential to people. I want to just flip the record because I think there's something, another part of this that people will expect us to be talking about, and that Pete already touched on, which is this question about whether or not video games, well, they have a historic association with do they cause more violent behavior? And you already alluded to that. I know it's a very tired question, but I just want to kind of put it to bed for us. So, having done the survey of the research, could you just elaborate a little bit more about the nature of that research and whether there is actually anything behind that?
I love this question because it's such a wild area, like for so many reasons. Like one of my favorite papers in this area is the titles does doing research on violent video games make researchers more aggressive, because everybody's such a loggerheads with each other about it all. So interesting, important societal question, right? Which is, when something really horrible and violent happens in the quote unquote real world, we want to try and make sense of that, and we want to try and understand why that's happened, so we can try and prevent it from happening again. We also look for simplistic stories, simplistic narratives, because we can cope with those more easily, particularly in those sorts of traumatic situations. And therefore, it's understandable why people point their fingers at video games. Video games, if you don't play them, there's quite a high barrier to entry in trying to understand them, and they look quite horrible sometimes if you're not understanding what's going on. So what's happened over the years is that there's this narrative built up around video games being this sort of unwholesome thing. They are primarily violent things. You're going around shooting people or whatever. And of course, then obviously they would make people more aggressive. And then we talked earlier about the difficulties of doing good causal experimental studies in the lab on this sort of stuff, and the violent video games research stuff is a really great example of that, because we've got these important, I think, reasonable, sensible questions revolving around these mass acts of societal violence. What's causing them? Is it the games? And that's what we're trying to answer. That's sensible. And then the way that most researchers try and answer this question is by giving participants a violent or a non-violent game to play, depending on what your definition of a violent game is, and then doing something else to measure aggression. And you've got to do that ethically and responsibly and safely. So you get these weird proxy measures of aggression. And I think the most commonly used one is called the competitive reaction time task. So you say to your participants, okay, we're gonna play a different game now. You're gonna wait until a red blob comes up on this screen, and you're going to press a button as quickly as possible. Somebody else is playing this at a computer in another room. If you press it before they do, you win, and you get to punish them. If they win, you lose, you get punished. And the punishment is you get to decide how long they get blasted with a loud noise and how loud the noise is. So there's your aggression measure. You be more aggressive if you choose to blast the other opponent who doesn't exist. It's all computer controlled. If you blast them with a louder noise for longer, right? Now, if you look at the research literature, there's more ways in which you can come up with a measure of violence based on that loudness and that duration. There are more ways to combine those than there are papers published. And if you analyze data in all of the different ways that you see in the literature, you can basically find whatever you want. You take one data set, analyze it in all the different ways that are present in the literature, you can find that violent video games definitely do cause aggression. They definitely don't, somewhere in the middle. So it's a useless area mostly. And what's happened, we see this with a lot of stuff around digital technology broadly, but video games specifically, is that everybody scrabbles around trying to figure out what an answer is to something that's scary and pressing and urgent, and they do it poorly. And you get really big negative effects. And as the research matures, as people get better at asking the right sorts of research questions, those effects either dampen down considerably or they disappear altogether. So the too long didn't read with the violent video games research is the best evidence we've got now is that they're not anything to worry about.
And if I can elaborate a little bit on that, the new question that people are asking and should be asking, and everyone should ask themselves, am I playing a game where I'm being exposed to violent extremist ideas and viewpoints? Has nothing to do with the content on the screen. It's not whether you're playing a video game where you're holding a realistic looking weapon and firing it at human beings. The danger that is truly, I think, an urgent threat to people's well-being and mental health and behavior in society it's coming from chat and from the kind of commentary that we're hearing. It's misogynistic, or it's racist, or it's homophobic. Extremist far-right groups are purposefully infiltrating video game communities to try to recruit primarily young men and expose them to ideas that are hate movements, essentially. And what's astounding to me is, like, why are we? I mean, the research literature is basically settled. As Pete suggested, we just can't prove a link between violent content on screen and violent real world actions. But anybody paying any attention can see that people are being radicalized through the human interactions, not what's on the screen, but what strangers are saying to us and giving us, YouTube links to go check out, and Discord communities to join. So anyway, I mean, that's, if we're thinking like, what's a real threat to mental health, that is a real and urgent and growing threat. And people are researching it and documenting it. And just individuals might want to ask themselves, am I participating in a game or a game community where I'm being exposed to this frequently? That is bad for my mental health. I should not spend time in these groups.
That's a really good and really important point. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I guess to summarize, the monster was the human after all, classic science fiction trope. So, I mean, you also alluding to those kind of social communities. I mean, that's obviously them at their worst and their most dangerous. But the social potential of video games is, putting those aside for a second, is actually huge, isn't it? Like there's this stereotypical image of the gamer alone in their cave, but gaming, particularly online gaming, can be a really effective tool in social engagement. I mean, I'm not even an online gamer. I play a lot of single player games, but it still makes me part of a community that I can engage with, that in the same way that I engage with fellow film lovers and science fiction fans and other things. So in your panel, in your opinion, is that social experience that we get in gaming, when it's positive, let's caveat that, mentally preparing us for social interactions in the outside world? Like, are there beneficial social skills that we can learn from those video game communities? I don't know who wants to
I think
jump in.
Yeah, Kelly, go first.
Go ahead, Jane. It's okay.
I should say very quickly something. Oh,
sorry, my terrible job as a chair. Kelly, you go first, then Jane.
Okay. Just from the clinical perspective, I have literally had people go do homework, which is to go talk to someone in a game. Obviously keeping it with consent and boundaries in place and all of that. But, a lot of times if you're working with someone who has social anxiety, just talking to someone they don't know, or even someone they do know, can be incredibly overwhelming for them. So having it as a place to kind of practice these kinds of social skills that people I might work with are experiencing, it's really invaluable. And it also helps them feel connected, because if they love this one niche game and they find somebody else who loves this one niche game, those two people might never meet in real life, or in the physical space. But now they've connected online through a shared interest. And that can do so much for, bolstering and increasing that social connection and proving that, there are people out there that like the same things I do. And there are people just as weird as I am. And sometimes you just have to ask them to play with you first.
Presumably, is there something as well about the fact that, as rich and detailed as modern video games can be, they are still grossly simplified versions of the world compared to the chaos that exists in the real world? And so is there something about that kind of more manageable environment for the social interaction to occur in that is valuable for people with severe autism, for example? Like, is that something that is beneficial in that respect?
I mean, what I hear from from young folks with autism that makes them feel comfortable in gaming environments. It's not so much the simplified world, it's the clear expectations and rule sets. You know, when you play a game, you agree to value the same mission or objective, and there are certain constraints that everybody's operating under, and it makes explicit what is sometimes not explicit in social encounters. You know, what should we care about? What's important? What am I allowed to do? What I'm not allowed to do? And so the clarity of the social situation in gaming can be very reassuring. Another thing that's interesting about gaming communities that's different from other communities that I think we should value and celebrate more is how much of a learning community gaming communities are, and the whole infrastructure that's developed online for people to learn how to overcome obstacles in games if they get stuck, if they're new to a game and they need to get oriented, if they want to see what excellence or virtuosity looks like in a game. You can watch people and their recordings of their gameplay, and there are wikis and there are Discord communities and there are, you know, tutorials. And my favorite thing is when a new game comes out, to watch the community that comes around it to investigate it, explore it, document it. It's like science, you know, it's everybody confronting an unknown at the same time and chipping in to add to the collective knowledge. That's a really cool kind of social aspect to gaming that, so, you know, my advice is like, play a game when it first comes out and look to be a part. Where is the learning happening? Where is the sharing happening? And be a part of that kind of fun, special moment.
Yeah, I love that idea of those gaming communities almost being a kind of scientific method in miniature, like unpacking it and kind of discovering everything. That's a really nice image. Thank you. Humans, every simple question always begins with humans have always been fascinated by games, but it's true, right? Like my partner is an Egyptologist, and she would probably run in from the side now and tell me that games have always existed, and you know, we've got ancient Egyptian board games and all sorts of things throughout history. And no doubt, in fact, actually, there was a recent Doctor Who episode that suggested that Catch was probably the first game. But we have probably always played games, and they've probably always played some sort of role in developing our cognitive abilities, problem-solving skills, hand-eye coordination in the case of Catch. Do you think that we touched on this a little bit, but do you think that remains true of video games? You know, are they on par with tactile, non-digital games in some fashion, or are they even better in some ways in those kind of skill development in the broad sense?
Do you want
Who's
that
going to go
one, Pete?
first? Yeah, I'll go first.
Go on,
Yeah,
Pete.
sure. I think I sometimes struggle with questions like this because there's this almost like this unspoken assumption that what we're going to be talking about is in the terms of the development and the future of games, that they're going to replace everything else that we do. And that's just never going to happen, right? And it's true now. Like, I love video games. I also love tabletop games. I also love going to the park with my kids. Like, there's not one that's better, or there's no ranking of that. I just enjoy doing different things. So I think video games will always be a part of that play ecosystem that we find ourselves in. And for some people, it's going to be a really big chunk of it. For others, it's going to be a very small, and that bit, and that's okay. You know, completely individual preferences as to what you like and what you don't like. And certainly, yeah, they definitely do impact our development. They can do that in good ways. They can do that potentially in bad ways. My feeling is that as we become better at talking about them, and therefore researching them, and then understanding, you know, why we engage with them, what we get out of them, we'll get better at curating those sorts of experiences, both for ourselves but everybody generally.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I was just going to say, we talk about how video games are more advanced and you know, bigger industry than ever, but we're also going through the golden era of tabletop games right now as well. And you're completely right; these two things are completely coexisting. So yeah. Sorry, who did I cut off there? Jane, was it you?
I was just another thing worth pointing out in terms of mental health is, I've also done a lot of work with the sports community, and research is increasingly showing that not everybody realistically has access to what we commonly refer to as like the social and emotional benefits of traditional sports in the real world, with like balls and equipment, and that not everyone at a young age can be successful at the kinds of sports that we're encouraged to play. Our bodies haven't developed, our brains haven't developed. It's like maybe half the population is not realistically going to be able to join an athletic team and be on a team, develop the leadership and competency and confidence. And the rise of esports has been really interesting in that at that age when joining a team is so important, and the idea of practice and commitment and dedication and showing up and dealing with the pressure of the big game, esports has given a lot of young people who may not have had a clear path through traditional athletic sports that same opportunity. And so it's like Pete's suggesting, it's not like one is going to replace the other or one's better than the other, but video games may have opened up an opportunity for different types of bodies and different types of brains to benefit from some of the things that other people have accessed more easily because they were born with a certain body or a certain, neurological response to increased heart rate or decreased oxygen levels. And so that is great too. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add on to what Jane said about esports, there was one time pre-pandemic where I got to go out to this all-girls school because they were having an esports tournament, and I was covering it. And just watching them engage, and they were very clear that many of the players told me, I mean, some of them were on like the local teams as well, but many of them told me like, yeah, I can't do soccer, or I don't like this, I don't like that. But when I'm playing with my team, I feel community, I feel connected. We collaborate, we plan, we strategize. There's so much teamwork involved. And I don't think people really think about that when they are thinking about video games as this space for developing those really important teamwork skills. I mean, if you've ever watched esports, just if you could ever listen in on like the chatter from the players, it's constant communication. And there's so much involved in building of those same skills. So whether you are physically able or not, you can still have those really amazing experiences that bring kids together and give those really valuable life skills that instill confidence and problem solving, both in the game itself, but also with each other.
That's great. And yeah, I mean, esports, a whole extra string to this that we unfortunately don't have time to pull on because we are almost out of time. But I think it's really good that we've acknowledged that, because it is this whole extra kind of part of the equation for us to think about in our own time, I guess. So thank you, all of you, for those really fascinating insights. As I said, we're approaching the end of the discussion, and I've just got enough time to be able to ask you one final question, one final thought. And so, we've acknowledged that, like all things, video games can be addictive. They can trigger increases in dopamine, in the same way that eating chocolate can, and other activities. And some people do suffer from different forms of gaming disorder or gaming addiction. So I think, can we end on something? What advice would you give to people who are struggling to find that healthy balance between their gaming lives and their quote unquote real lives? And what is a healthy amount of game time? How would you categorize that? And Jane, would you like to answer that first?
Sure. Okay, two really practical pieces of advice. Involve more people who you really care about and want to deepen and strengthen your relationship with in your gaming. If you feel like gaming is becoming too much for you, or it's kind of interfering with the rest of your life in some way, invite someone who doesn't play games to learn a game with you, or try to spend more time, whether it's a family or friend, or just have conversations. Can I tell you about this game that I'm playing and why it's so hard, and this problem I'm trying to solve in it, or skill I'm trying to develop? Just try to make it more relational. And that is a huge practical step. If you have someone in your life you think is gaming too much, just play with them or sit with them when they play and watch them and talk to them about it. It's huge healing benefits. And just the second practical thing, in my house, you have to do an hour of physical activity. And then you can play for an hour of video games, whether it's like taking a walk or yoga or whatever. Unless you're sick, then you can play as much as you want. But we just try to have an equal movement and gameplay, and we feel like very good about that.
Great. I don't know, is there a loop? We don't have time to answer this, but is there a loophole for physical games like Wii Fit and things like that? I don't know. Peter, do you have a thought on this?
I mean, not that I could possibly plug my new book, which is coming out this week, which has an entire chapter on digital addiction and how we rethink it. But what we want to talk about there is broadly about digital addictions, but I think it's true for thinking about video games, that I worry sometimes about how much we talk about gaming addiction when actually it's very unlikely that you've come across anybody that clinically will be diagnosed with that. But when we talk about being addicted to things in a really negative sense, we're unhappy with that. It really disempowers us to do something about it, right? This is something that's happened to us almost, and we need to seek out outside treatment. I think a lot of us instead maybe struggle sometimes with bad gaming habits instead. And if you can rethink the way that we interact with games in that sense, habits are neutral in and of themselves. They're not harmful, they're not beneficial, but other things can impact on habits to make them good or bad. So one of the big things with habits, particularly around gaming habits, which I think this is a particularly susceptible area, is that if you're engaging in it often but not in a reflective sense, so you're just almost doing it mindlessly, then that's when you open yourself up to risk. I think so. If you can just check in with yourself a little bit more, think about what your own goals are, both short and long term. Is what you're doing in the gaming world, is that aligning with your goals at the minute? If it is, great, it's fine, nothing to worry about. If it's not, maybe that's something where you need to rethink why you're doing that at that point. And there's no judgment or shame or anything there. It's just about having conversations with yourself every so often and going, am I enjoying this? Am I getting something out of it? And if the answer to that's no, thinking about why that's the case and what you can do differently. And like Jane says, communication is a super important part of this. Talking to people around you, having open and positive and collaborative conversations about this, not being judgmental about it, is really important.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And Kelli, do you want to bring it home for us? What's your answer to this question?
So as a clinician, I definitely take, I have a lot of feelings about the word addiction and how it's used in a variety of different ways. And I always like to remind people that it is one of the most stigmatized mental illnesses. And so when we are putting that label on people, kind of the opposite of what Pete was saying, it's like there is judgment. And like, oh, that means you just can't control yourself. Now, that's unfair to people who have chemical addictions, but it's also unfair to people who are struggling to manage their gameplay. And that's typically how I talk about it. I have absolutely been referred people who have been told that, oh, I have gaming addiction. And then you sit down and you talk with them and go, oh, your significant other just died, and this is the only thing you're doing to stay afloat. Oh, you're struggling in school and you're being horribly bullied, and this is the only place you have a sense of self-efficacy or that like your life matters. Is that the healthiest coping mechanism? No, we can't live in these digital worlds. But is it getting you through that really difficult moment? Is that why you are playing so much to the exclusion of others? And that is consistently what I have seen as a clinician, like on the ground, and also what the most recent research specifically on people presenting with gaming disorder has also found is that games are being used as a maladaptive coping strategy for something else going on. And that's so important because when we give somebody a label, that informs the clinician like myself how to treat. And so I treat somebody who is experiencing depression differently than somebody who has an actual like chemical addiction. And so if we're labeling people with this term and that evokes a sense of treatment that there is no actually verified or accepted treatment for gaming disorder also, it gives this impression of what they should be doing. Just stop, just quit, go cold turkey. Well, if this is the only coping support somebody has, even if it's not the healthiest, one of the worst things you can do is yoink that coping strategy from them. And so it becomes more about like harm reduction and scaling back. And it looks so much more like what I would work with somebody with an impulse control issue as opposed to an addictive one. And so it can become very clinical in the terms, but words have meaning and they have power. And so for anybody out there, games are supposed to be something that we enjoy. We can struggle, we can get mad, we can get angry within our games. Like we can have hard fun. But at the end of your gaming session, if you're coming out feeling angry or upset or lower energy than when you came in, that is a fantastic flag to kind of reevaluate your relationship with that game and just ask yourself, again, like Pete said, non-judgmentally, what am I getting out of this? Is this something that I am genuinely still enjoying and invested in my time? Or is it something that maybe I'm feeling obligated to do because I don't want to let down the raid team? Or is it something I'm feeling pressured to do because if I don't go water my crops, they will just die and then I have lost all of that investment in time. So there's lots of reasons that we play. And so connecting with why you're playing and what you're getting out of games is going to give you so much information about your relationship with games.
That was a masterclass. That was amazing. That was awesome. I love that.
Thank you.
Truly. But also that, all three of you, thank you for those really thoughtful and insightful answers, not just to that final question, but throughout this event this evening. Thank you so much. But alas, that is the time that we have been allocated. That's all that we have for tonight. So it's been an absolute pleasure to be joined tonight by a brilliant panel of speakers this evening. At home watching this, please give them a round of applause. We've talked a lot about the benefits of games and what gaming means to people. And I think for me, takeaway lesson is that play is okay, that it's okay to play, to have fun, but talking to yourself and talking to each other is and always will be the key to beginning to have good mental health. So take that away. I certainly will. Thank you for watching this evening. Do make sure to visit the Science Museum soon, where you can also check out Power Up, our interactive gaming gallery, where you can play a selection of the very best video games and consoles from the past 50 years, something like 120 different games and consoles. I should also mention that the next edition in the Open Talk series will take place on the 28th of March, and that will be a discussion about tackling the lack of diversity in genetic databases. And finally, if you'd like to support the Science Museum Group across all of its 5 sites in the UK, which are free to visit, with their mission to inspire the next generation of scientists, technicians, engineers, mathematicians, and medics, you can find a link to donate in the description below. So that just leaves me to once again thank our speakers, Dr. Kelli Dunlap, Professor Peter Etchells, and Dr. Jane McGonigal. And from me, a final thanks to all of you at home for watching this evening. Good night.